The ANC may have just destroyed the South African economy by picking a fight with the United States. Here's why. So both the ANC and the ANC-controlled DIRCO decided to issue condemnations against the United States due to the capture of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. In fact, South Africa's Foreign Affairs Department went so far as to call for a United Nations Security Council meeting to explore the United States' actions in Venezuela. And as a result, it inadvertently turned the US into public enemy number one for the ANC and unfortunately for the South African government by extension. By picking a fight with the United States, South Africa, or rather the ANC, could in fact cause the economy to implode. But before I get into the reason why, could I please remind you to subscribe to the channel? It's completely free, and all you've got to do is click on the subscribe button below. Also, if you would like to enjoy some additional benefits, consider becoming a Power Club member. All you have to do is click on the join button below the video. Now let's get into it. So the reason why I say that South Africa's economy is at risk is because of the enormous trade relationship that South Africa has with the United States. Now, before we get into the figures themselves, it's really important to understand that in addition to being one of South Africa's largest trade partners, the United States has, first of all, helped with many humanitarian issues, such as AIDS and HIV retrovirals. And we've also seen how back during apartheid, they attempted to put economic sanctions and pressure on South Africa in order to bring an end to the unjust regime. But even if we look at the modern day, we see how there are more United States companies operating in South Africa than any other foreign nation. And the US has provided more jobs to South Africa than any other foreign country. But beyond that, if we go into the statistics, we see just how heavily reliant South Africa is on US trade. So here we have a report from the South African Revenue Service, SARS, on South Africa's trade statistics, specifically by November 2025. So at the time of recording, these are the most up-to-date statistics that are publicly available to us. And if we take a look here, we see how we receive an export and import overview for November 2025, as well as the top countries that South Africa has done trade with. And something becomes very clear. So while South Africa has done very well to have a 37 billion rand trade surplus, the countries who South Africa is exporting products to are quite different to the ones they're importing from. So at face value, it seems that China is overwhelmingly South Africa's most important trade partner, right? Because we see them as the number one trade partner for exports and imports. But what's really important to understand is that the exports to China are far lower than the imports from China. We see how China made up for over a quarter of South Africa's imports for the period, but they only made up 10.2% of the exports. And so South Africa runs a heavy trade deficit with China, meaning that South Africa spends far more money on Chinese products than China spends on South African products. For the United States, however, the inverse is true. As we can see here, 7.1% of South African imports come from the United States, whereas 7.6% of the exports are to the United States. And it's also important to note how exports are 37 billion rand more than imports. And so South Africa has a pretty healthy trade surplus with the United States. But even if we drill down further, look at the export list. We see that Germany is second with 8.9%. That is a US and Western ally. Japan at 5.3% is a US and Western ally. And in fifth place is the United Kingdom with 4.7%, yet again a US and Western ally. And so apart from China, the main export destinations for South African products are the US and the West. Looking at imports, we see how China is an overwhelming destination for imports, followed by the US as mentioned. And then on par with the US is India. So India is a pretty neutral country. They are friendly with Western countries as well as the BRICS and the Global South nations. And we see that there are far more imports from India than exports to India. They're followed by Germany, yet again a Western ally, and Thailand, who is not actually aligned with the Global South, despite being geographically located in the Far East, specifically Southeast Asia. But the depth of how important the US relation is can be shown when we deep dive into the data itself. So here we have a report directly from SARS titled Cumulative Bilateral Trade by Country 2025. And so this report shows us how many imports and exports South Africa has had from every country, dating from January 2025 to November 2025. So for the entire year to date at the time of release. And what becomes clear is how the Chinese relationship is vastly different to the US relationship. So I've taken the liberty of hiding some columns just to make this a little bit easier to read. And so we see that China is first over here. Now, if we take a look, we see that for the year to date, South Africa exported over 202 billion rands worth of products to China. But if we look at the imports, it's 384 billion. So let's just do our maths here. If we take the 384 billion and subtract the 202 billion, we see that South Africa has run a trade deficit of 181 billion rand with China. And so South Africa spends far more money in China than China spends in South Africa. But if we dive deeper, we see that this is even more serious than it first seems, because a lot of the products that South Africa exports to China, China refines and repurposes and sells back to South Africa for a profit. So one very good example of this is the steel and metals industry. So if we take a look at iron and steel, we see how South Africa has exported 27.3 billion rands worth to China. However, it has received back 33.2 billion rands worth from China. And that is because China will take the raw steel and iron from South Africa, process it, and then sell the final product back to South Africa because the local steel industry has pretty much collapsed. What's also pretty apparent is how in textiles, a lot of South African products that are sold to China have been processed and refined in China and used in the manufacturing process to eventually create clothes which are sold back to South Africa. So for example, if we look at raw hides and leather, we see that 523 million rands worth have been exported to China. And we also see our textiles have been exported to the value of 3.8 billion rand. But as soon as we look at the final products coming back, take a look at this. 28.1 billion rands worth of textiles have been imported from China over the past year. 10.5 billion rands worth of footwear have been imported from China throughout the year. And something that's also important to note is how different raw materials are used to create machinery, right? Machinery that people will buy in shops and that South African factories may buy. If we take a look at the machinery that's gone out to China, it's just over 1 billion rands worth. But look at the amount of machinery coming from China, 174 billion rands worth. And so what's actually going on is abundantly clear. South Africa is suffering as a result of its trade with China. Yes, it's exporting different raw materials, but what it's getting back far outweighs the amount of money that South Africa has made off of exports to China. But if we look at the US relationship, the opposite is true. So going to the America tab, we see how, with regards to the United States, South Africa has exported 136 billion rands worth of products. But for the same period, we see that the US has only exported 121 billion rands worth of products to South Africa. So again, we're going to do the math here, and we're going to take the number of exports minus the number of imports, and boom, we see how South Africa actually runs a 14.9 billion rand trade surplus with the US, because after all, the US is interested in buying South African products because they're cheaper. Obviously, the exchange rate works in their favor, and it costs a lot less money to buy the products from cheap places like South Africa than make them locally. So it's a very beneficial deal for South Africa. Also, if we take a look at a lot of the products that are being exported, we can see how there are a lot more final products that are making their way to the United States. So, for example, 20 billion rands worth of vehicles, aircraft, and vessels. We see again precious metal, which is very popular. Prepared foodstuffs is very high. Vegetables are very high. Chemicals are very high. Minerals, which again are raw materials. And then, of course, precious metals and iron and steel. But again, this shows us how both raw materials and finished products are being exported en masse to the United States. And so this is a very beneficial trade partner for South Africa. But beyond that, there has been this argument that if South Africa loses its trade with the US, well, we can just turn to other BRICS partners, right? So already we've seen how the most crucial BRICS partner is not really that interested in buying products from South Africa and making South Africans money. They're far more interested in being the net seller, the net exporter to South Africa. But let's take a look at another big member of BRICS, namely Russia. So as we head over to the European tab, we see that South African exports to Russia totaled 6.7 billion rand. Let's take a look at the imports, 6.1 billion rand. So it's great that South Africa is able to have a trade surplus with Russia, but you're comparing 6.7 billion rand and 6.1 billion rand with the United States total of 136 billion rand in exports and 121 billion rand in imports. The two just cannot compare. Trade with Russia is just a blip in the ocean compared to trade with the United States. And so the conclusion is abundantly clear. South Africa needs the United States to operate, whether it likes it or not. This constant alienation of the United States and what South Africa did, and specifically the ANC did, on the world stage, particularly regarding Venezuela, was absolutely the wrong move. This is the kind of move that is going to further antagonize the United States. It's the kind of move that could eventually see sanctions come to South Africa. And even if the US doesn't do what it did in Venezuela, where perhaps SEAL Team 6 comes into South Africa and kidnaps Cyril Ramaphosa, doesn't matter. The economic consequences are going to be enough to make South Africans suffer. As we see from these statistics, there is no other place where South Africa is going to be able to replicate its trade with the US, because after all, even if you think other Western and European countries are going to somehow be open to trading with South Africa, we know that their allegiance to the US and their reliance on the US is far more important than South Africa. And so if they decide that the US is going to put too much pressure on them if they don't side with the US, well, hey, they're going to jump ship and they're going to go with the US as well. And this whole dream of siding with BRICS and having this massive trade with BRICS just isn't stacking up in reality. We've seen the data right here, and we can see that there is nobody else in the world capable of filling the void that the US will leave behind. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you found it informative, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.